Welcome to Lore of the Lost, where we uncover stories from the past steeped in truth and historical accuracy. Get unheard of perspectives and discover what life was really like during these times. Listen to the boring history as you drift off into another world. I am George Lancaster, your speaker tonight, and please let me hear where you're listening from and what time it is for you in the comments. Now listen along as we adventure into the world of ancient Rome, where the sand of the arena held both glory and despair, and where one man's journey from slavery to the Colosseum reveals the brutal reality behind the spectacle. The morning air in Capua carried the scent of olive oil and baking bread as Marcus Gaius Tertius made his way through the narrow streets toward the imposing walls of the Ludus. Across the Roman Empire, training gladiators was a popular source of revenue. More than 100 gladiator schools stretched from modern-day Vienna, Austria, to Ephesus, Turkey, and beyond. This particular school, owned by Lucius Batiatus, housed nearly 200 men within its fortress-like walls, and Marcus had been among them for 3 years now. The wooden gate creaked open as the guards recognized his approach. Marcus had earned certain privileges through his victories: the right to leave the Ludus on supervised errands, better sleeping quarters than the newest recruits, and most importantly, the knowledge that his next fight might not be his last. The odds of surviving a single fight were about 5 to 1. The typical gladiator fought only 2 or 3 times a year. Half died during their first year in the arena, but for those who survived their rookie year, life after the arena was a real possibility. Inside the Ludus, the familiar sounds of training echoed off the stone walls. The training regimen for a gladiator was vigorous. Many hours were spent daily practicing with wooden swords weighted to be twice as heavy as real metal ones and shields heavier than those used in combat. Muscles were built up to a level that bones were deformed. Marcus paused to watch a group of new recruits, their bodies already showing the telltale signs of the intensive conditioning. Attack and counterattack were practiced until responses were reflexive and instantaneous. Stamina, strength, and intimate knowledge of how an opponent would fight could make the difference between life and death. The morning meal awaited in the communal eating area. Most people in the Roman Empire had a vegetarian diet, and it turns out that the gladiators were no different. They relied on wheat and barley and plant proteins like beans to get their protein fix. Marcus ladled a generous portion of the thick barley porridge, known as pulse, into his wooden bowl. Gladiators ate a lot of carbs, usually in something called pulse, which was a kind of porridge. Cato the Elder wrote a recipe for pulse, which was made with barley and fava beans. It's simply beans and barley boiled for a long time with some onion, vinegar, and garlic, because, as the ancients would say, ubi allium, ibi Roma. Where there is the smell of garlic, there is Rome. The ancient historian Plinius refers to gladiators as hordeari, barley eaters. This nickname had followed them for generations, and Marcus understood why. Gladiators ate lots of simple carbohydrates, which included foods like barley. This helped them get some fat under their skin, which in turn protected them from cuts and wounds and shielded nerves during a fight. It's estimated that around 70–80% of their diet was made up of starches, which allowed them to get plenty of energy for their rigorous training. The strategic purpose behind this diet became clear to Marcus during his first serious wound. The goal was to have a layer of fat overlying vulnerable blood vessels and nerves so a shallow cut wouldn't prove disastrous. Fat tissue can bleed impressively, making spectators marvel at the fighter's ability to continue the battle while not being a crippling injury. What appeared to be devastating wounds often proved superficial, allowing gladiators to continue fighting while the crowd roared in appreciation of their apparent invincibility. After the meal, Marcus made his way to the small shrine where many gladiators offered prayers before training. To build strong bones, a drink made from the ashes of bones and charred wood was served. According to Pliny the Elder, they mixed ashes to create a tonic-like drink which they used after their fights and training. And that might have actually been the case. Their levels of calcium and strontium, found in plant ashes, were really high. This means they likely used the tonic to supply extra calcium and magnesium to promote bone healing. The training courtyard buzzed with activity as different classes of gladiators practiced their specialized techniques. Marcus was a retiarius, one of the most distinctive and challenging gladiator types. The retiarius, net fighter, developed in the early Augustan period. He carried a trident and a net, equipment styled on that of a fisherman. The retiarius wore a loincloth held in place by a wide belt and a larger arm guard, manica, extending to the shoulder and left side of the chest. He fought without the protection of a helmet. His primary opponent in the arena would be the secutor, a heavily armored gladiator specifically designed to counter the retiarius's advantages. The secutor, pursuer, was developed to fight the retiarius. As a variant of the mumio, he wore the same armor and weapons, including the tall rectangular shield and the gladius. The helmet of the secutor, however, covered the entire face with the exception of two small eye holes, in order to protect his face from the thin prongs of the trident of his opponent. The helmet was also round and smooth, so that the retiarius net could not get a grip on it. Marcus picked up his practice weapons, a weighted wooden trident and a lead-weighted net. The contrast between his light armor and that of his sparring partner, a secutor named Gaius, was stark. In a classic matchup, one of the retiarius's most common adversaries was the secutor, a gladiator heavily armored with a rounded helmet, large shield, scutum, and short sword, gladius. The secutor's name derived from the Latin for pursuer, signifying that he chased the retiarius around the arena. While the secutor's heavy equipment offered significant protection, it also limited mobility, making it potentially difficult to catch and corner a nimble retiarius. The morning training session began with the doctor, a former gladiator who had earned his freedom and now served as instructor. The daily routine within the ludus was relentless and unforgiving. Dawn till dusk training. Supervised by a head trainer, often a retired gladiator himself, the days were filled with grueling physical training. Exercises focused on building strength, stamina, and swordsmanship. The doctor's scarred face and missing left eye served as constant reminders of the price of a single mistake in the arena. Marcus practiced the fundamental movements of his fighting style, the wide sweeping casts of the net, the precise thrusts of the trident, the quick footwork necessary to stay out of reach of heavily armored opponents. Unlike the more standard matchups, like the mumio versus the thryax, where both combatants wore substantial armor, a retiarius introduced a tension and drama derived from the riskiness of wearing almost no protection. He relied heavily on skill, cunning, and careful footwork. This contrast between nimble attacker and heavily armored foe was appealing to crowds who wanted to see suspenseful cat-and-mouse confrontations. The training was methodical and repetitive. Bouts seldom lasted 30 minutes and might be over in a minute, but a longer, fiercer fight might impress the crowd enough that the loser might be spared to fight again. A new gladiator, tyro, usually trained for a year or more before his first appearance in a professional bout. Marcus remembered his own year as a tyro, the endless hours of conditioning, the gradual mastery of his weapons, the psychological preparation for the reality of mortal combat. As the sun reached its zenith, the gladiators broke for their midday meal and rest period. The gladiators slept in 32 square foot, 3 square meter cells, home to 1 or 2 people. Those cells were kept separate from a wing holding bigger rooms for their trainers. Marcus's cell was slightly larger than those of the newest recruits, a privilege earned through his victories. Beyond the training ground is the eating area for the gladiators, and on this floor are their cells/rooms. Only the gladiators of higher worth are allowed rooms of their own. The trainee gladiators and others sleep with a few others in cells similar to those in a prison. The afternoon brought word that would change everything. A messenger had arrived from Rome with news of upcoming games at the Colosseum. The most famous schools were clustered around the Colosseum, and visitors to Rome can still see the remnants of Ludus Magnus, the largest school that was connected to the Colosseum by tunnels. Marcus would be among those selected to travel to the capital, to fight in the greatest arena in the empire. The journey to Rome took 3 days, the gladiators traveling in a heavily guarded wagon train. The discovery shows that even outside Rome, gladiators were big business, Neubauer says. At least 80 gladiators, likely more, lived in the large 2-story facility, equipped with a practice arena in its central courtyard. It was a prison. They were prisoners, says Wolfgang Neubauer. They lived in cells in a fortress with only one gate out. The reality of their status was never far from their minds, despite the potential glory that awaited. Upon arrival in Rome, Marcus was housed in the Ludus Magnus, the great gladiatorial school that served the Colosseum directly. The Ludus Magnus functioned as the leading gladiatorial school in Rome. Upon arriving to the Ludus, gladiators would be separated based on their fighting specialty and then assigned a doctor for their specialty, as well as placed under the general oversight of a lanista. It is here that the gladiators would eat, train, and sleep on a regular basis. The scale of the Ludus Magnus dwarfed anything Marcus had experienced. The training portion of their days was extensive, but also public. As was customary, the Romans often watched the gladiators train, as we know that the seating provided at this Ludus accommodated approximately 3,000 spectators. This effectively served as a sort of precursor to the games, a taste of what was to come at the Ludi Romani. The constant scrutiny of potential spectators added another layer of pressure to the already intense preparation. The night before the games, Marcus lay in his cell, listening to the sounds of the great city beyond the walls. A barred gate separates the gladiators from the living quarters above the Ludus, which house Batiatus, Lucretia, and their slaves. The gate is locked every night when the gladiators are shut away for sleep. The contrast between their confinement and the freedom that lay just beyond those gates was a constant reminder of what they fought for, the chance to earn their liberty through blood and skill. The morning of the games dawned clear and bright. On the morning of the games, spectators flooded in through 80 different entrance arches and up countless stairways to their allocated seats, where they awaited the procession marking the opening of the games to the sound of trumpets and fanfares. Marcus could hear the growing crowd even from the underground chambers of the Colosseum, their voices creating a constant rumble that seemed to shake the very foundations of the great amphitheater. The structure of the day's events followed a time-honored tradition. These all-day spectacles were typically divided into 3 parts: animal hunts in the morning, executions at midday, and gladiatorial games in the afternoon. Their turn in the arena would only come later, though, as the games usually began with elaborate wild animal hunts in the morning. During the midday interval, the so-called Ludi Meridiani took place, where condemned criminals were thrown to the surviving beasts, or made to reenact grisly ancient myths. The climax of the day came during the afternoon, however, when the stage was cleared for the main event: gladiator combat. As Marcus waited in the holding areas beneath the arena, he could hear the roar of the crowd above as the morning's venations unfolded. A sport called venatio, which translates literally as hunting, was introduced at amphitheaters across ancient Rome. It involved the hunting and killing of wild animals and would often take place in the morning ahead of the gladiatorial battles that afternoon. The sounds filtering down through the floor told their own story: the snarls of exotic beasts, the clash of weapons, the cheers and gasps of 50,000 spectators. The midday executions brought a different quality to the crowd's response. The execution of convicted criminals, early Christians and non-citizens of Rome was the midday spectacle, says Elkins. While many ordinary Romans would watch these executions, the noble and respectable citizens left to take their lunch outside of the amphitheater during the violence, before returning for the gladiatorial fights in the afternoon. Although the executions were seen as symbolizing Rome's power, the higher classes normally took advantage of this interval to leave the arena to dine. Finally, as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western hills, the moment arrived. At the end of the procession, the gladiators emerged, the star attractions that the masses of spectators had come to see. Marcus felt the mechanical lift beneath his feet begin to rise, carrying him from the subterranean chambers up into the blazing light of the arena floor. The roar of the crowd hit him like a physical force as he emerged into the sand-covered space that would determine his fate. The Colosseum stretched around him in all its magnificent brutality. Nothing epitomizes the Roman attitude toward the value of human life better than this marvel of Roman architecture that let up to 85,000 people watch as men fought and died, urged on by the roar of the bloodthirsty crowd. The tiers of seating rose in carefully ordered sections, each social class in its designated place, all united in their hunger for spectacle. Marcus's opponent emerged from the opposite side of the arena, a secutor whose polished armor gleamed in the afternoon sun. The crowd's anticipation was palpable as they recognized the classic pairing. Matches between these two archetypes provided a vivid depiction of a predator-prey dynamic that could shift in an instant if the retiarius managed to ensnare his opponent, or if the secutor cornered him against the walls of the arena. Surviving artistic depictions and literary anecdotes emphasize the tension and cat-and-mouse nature of these duels. A well-timed net throw might lead to a swift victory. A poorly timed lunge could end in sudden death for the retiarius. The referee, the summa rudis, signaled the beginning of combat. Marcus immediately began his tactical dance around the arena, using his mobility advantage to stay out of reach while seeking an opening. Secutors needed a plan that was all about closing in quickly. Since the retiarius used a net and trident to keep away, the secutor tried to chase fast and block attacks with their shield. They pushed forward to avoid getting tangled in the net and to stop the retiarius from using their advantage at longer range. Once close, the secutor would use strong thrusts with the gladius and cover themselves with the shield. The fight unfolded with the methodical precision of years of training. Marcus cast his net in wide arcs, each throw calculated to either ensnare his opponent or force him into a disadvantageous position. The secutor pressed forward relentlessly, his heavy shield absorbing the thrusts of Marcus's trident while seeking to corner the more mobile fighter against the arena wall. The crowd's reaction shifted with each exchange. Gasps when Marcus's net came tantalizingly close to entangling his opponent, roars of approval when the secutor's advance forced the retiarius into desperate evasive maneuvers. This was the spectacle they had come to see. Not merely violence, but skilled combat between professionals who had dedicated their lives to their deadly art. After what felt like hours, but was likely only minutes, Marcus saw his opportunity. As the secutor overextended in a particularly aggressive thrust, Marcus cast his net with perfect timing. The weighted mesh settled over his opponent's shield, arm, and shoulder, the lead weights wrapping around the armor and binding the secutor's movement. Before his opponent could cut free, Marcus drove his trident forward, the three prongs finding the gap between breastplate and helmet. The crowd erupted as the secutor fell to one knee, trapped and wounded. Marcus held his position, trident at his opponent's throat, and looked to the imperial box for the decision. A defeated gladiator could beg for mercy by raising one finger. If spared, he returned to the ludus to heal and train. Repeated poor performance, dishonor, or the editor's decision could still lead to execution in the arena. The emperor's thumb turned upward. Mercy. The secutor would live to fight another day. Marcus stepped back and raised his trident in salute to the crowd, their cheers washing over him like a tide of validation. He had survived another day in the arena, earned another purse, moved one step closer to the freedom that remained his ultimate goal. As he was escorted from the arena floor, Marcus reflected on the strange duality of his existence. Gladiators and former gladiators worked outside the arena as bodyguards, debt collectors, and enforcers to settle disputes. They also served as sparring partners and personal trainers for men and for women who wanted to fight privately. Some of his fellow gladiators had already earned enough victories to purchase their freedom, moving into new lives as trainers, bodyguards, or even small businessmen. The path back to the Ludus Magnus took him through the same underground tunnel that had brought him to the arena. As noted in textual sources and still undergoing inconclusive excavations carried out in relation to the Colosseum, there was an underground passage that connected the gladiatorial school with the Flavian amphitheater. The transition from the roar of the crowd to the relative quiet of the school's corridors always felt jarring. A return to the mundane reality that lay behind the spectacle. That evening, as Marcus cleaned his equipment and tended to minor wounds, he considered his future. Memorial stones in gladiator cemeteries provide ample evidence that many gladiators married and raised families. Some managed to build lives beyond the arena, though always carrying the scars, both physical and psychological, of their years in the ludus. The good, the bad, and the ugly of gladiatorial life were inextricably intertwined. The good, the chance for glory, the possibility of freedom, the brotherhood forged in shared danger, the respect of crowds who saw them as heroes. The bad, The constant threat of death, the rigid hierarchy of the ludus, the knowledge that they were property to be bought and sold. The ugly, the reality that their entertainment value depended on their willingness to die for the amusement of others. The brutalization of human life for spectacle, the systematic dehumanization that made such games possible. Yet within this system, men like Marcus found ways to maintain their dignity and humanity. They formed friendships that transcended the artificial divisions of the arena. They developed skills that commanded respect even from their captors. They created a culture within the ludus that honored courage, skill, and loyalty to one's brothers in arms. As the months passed, Marcus continued to fight and win. Each victory brought him closer to the magic number. Enough wins to earn his rudies, the wooden sword that symbolized freedom. However, this path was fraught with danger. The life expectancy of a gladiator was notoriously short, and even the most skilled could fall victim to the whims of the crowd or an unlucky strike. The arena was an unforgiving teacher, and even the smallest mistake could prove fatal. The social dynamics of the ludus reflected the complex hierarchies of Roman society itself. Within the confines of a ludus, daily life followed a strict routine, and a clear hierarchy was established among those who trained. At the top were the seasoned veterans and champions, celebrated ancient Roman gladiators who had survived countless gladiator games and basked in the glory and relative freedoms their successes afforded. Below them were the novices, the raw material of the ludus, who lived and trained in the shadows of the greats, aspiring to one day achieve similar renown, or at the very least, survival. The psychological toll of gladiatorial life was as significant as the physical demands. Life in the ludus wasn't solely about physical prowess. Trainers also instilled a sense of mental toughness and a willingness to die in the arena. This could involve psychological manipulation, public humiliation, or even forced witnessing of executions. Some gladiators even fought with chained opponents to desensitize them to the fear of death. The medical care available to gladiators was surprisingly sophisticated, driven by the economic necessity of protecting valuable investments. Gladiators received attentive medical care from arena physicians who pioneered surgical techniques. The school employed skilled medics who understood the specific injuries common to gladiatorial combat, developing treatments that would return fighters to the arena as quickly as possible. Marcus's final fight came on a sweltering summer day when the awnings stretched over the Colosseum provided little relief from the heat. His opponent was a veteran Murmillo, a fighter whose defensive style and heavy armor had carried him through dozens of contests. The Murmillo, plural murmillones, or Myrmillo, wore a helmet with a stylized fish on the crest, the mormillos or sea fish, as well as an arm guard, manica, a loincloth and belt, a gaiter on his right leg, thick wrappings covering the tops of his feet, and a very short greave with an indentation for the padding at the top of the feet. The fight was brutal and prolonged, neither man able to gain a decisive advantage. The crowd grew restless as the combat stretched on, their bloodlust demanding resolution. Finally, in a moment of desperate inspiration, Marcus feinted with his net, and then used his trident not as a thrusting weapon, but as a lever, catching the Murmillo's shield and wrenching it aside long enough to drive his dagger into the gap in his opponent's armor. As the Murmillo fell, the crowd's roar reached a crescendo. Marcus had won his freedom, not just this fight, but his liberty itself. The editor of the games, recognizing both the quality of the combat and Marcus's long record of victories, awarded him his rudies on the spot. The wooden sword was placed in his hands as the crowd cheered, marking the end of his career as a gladiator and the beginning of his life as a free man. Walking away from the arena for the last time, Marcus carried with him the complex legacy of his years as a gladiator. He had survived in a system designed to consume him, had found honor in circumstances that sought to strip it away, had maintained his humanity in the face of systematic dehumanization. The scars on his body told the story of his journey, but they also testified to his resilience and skill. The reality of gladiatorial life bore little resemblance to the romanticized versions that would later capture popular imagination. It was a world of rigid discipline, constant danger, and carefully calculated spectacle. Yet within that world, men and women found ways to create meaning. to forge bonds of loyalty and friendship, to maintain their dignity even in the face of death. Marcus's story was one of thousands played out in the arenas of the Roman Empire, each representing an individual human experience within a vast system of entertainment that depended on the willingness of some to die for the amusement of others. The good, the bad, and the ugly of gladiatorial life were not separate elements, but part of a complex whole that reflected the values, contradictions, and brutal realities of Roman civilization itself. In the end, the gladiators of Rome were neither the noble heroes of legend nor the simple victims of oppression, but complex individuals navigating an impossible system with whatever dignity, courage, and humanity they could preserve. Their legacy lives on, not just in the ruins of the Colosseum, but in the eternal human struggle to find meaning and maintain honor in the face of overwhelming adversity.